So in the last video, we created and started two Docker containers, MongoDB and MongoExpress. And these are the commands that we used to make it happen, right? The first, we created a network where these two containers can talk to each other using just the container name, and no host, port, etc. is necessary for that. And then we actually ran two Docker run commands with all the options and environmental variables, etc. set. Now, this way of starting containers all the time is a little bit tedious, and you don't want to execute these run commands all the time on the command line terminal, especially if you have a bunch of Docker containers to run. You probably want to automate it or just make it a little bit easier. And there's a tool that makes running multiple Docker containers with all this configuration much easier than with Docker run commands, and that is Docker Compose. If you already know Docker Compose and you were wondering why is it useful and what it actually does, then bear with me. In the next slide, I'm going to explain that. So this is a Docker run command of the MongoDB that we executed previously. So basically, with Docker Compose file, what we can do is we can take the whole command with its configuration and map it into a file so that we have a structured commands. So if you have, let's say, 10 Docker containers that you want to run for your application, and they all need to talk to each other and interact with each other, you can basically write all the run commands for each container in a structured way in the Docker Compose. And we'll see how that structure actually looks like. So on the right side in the Docker Compose example, the first two tags are always there, right? Version 3, that's the latest version of the Compose, Docker Compose, and then we have the services. This is where the container list goes. So the first one is MongoDB, and that maps actually to the container name, right? This is going to be a part of container name when Docker creates a container out of this configuration blueprint. The next one is actually the image, right? So we need to know which image that container is going to be built from. And of course, you can specify a version tag here next to the name. The next one is port. So we can also specify which ports is going to open. First one is on the host, and the second one after the colon is on the container. So the port mapping is there. And of course, the environmental variables can be also mapped in the Docker Compose. And this is how actually the structure of Docker Compose looks like for one specific command. Let's actually see the second container command for MongoExpress that we executed and how to map that. So now again, we have a Docker run command for MongoExpress, and let's see how we can map it into a Docker Compose. So as I said, services will list the containers that we want to create. And again, names, MongoExpress will map to the container name. The next one will be the image. Again, you can add a tag here if you want to be have a specific one. Then you have the ports, 80 to 8080. And then you have all the environmental variables, again, under the attribute environment. And this is how the Docker Compose will look like. So basically, Docker Compose is just a structured way to contain very normal common Docker commands. And of course, it's going to be easier for you to edit the file if you want to change some variables, or if you want to change the ports, or if you want to add some new options to the run command, so to say. And maybe you already noticed the network configuration is not there in the Docker Compose. So this Mongo network that we created, we don't have to do it in a Docker Compose. If we go to the next slide, because we have the same concept here, we have containers that will talk to each other using just the container name. So what Docker Compose will do is actually take care of creating a common network for these containers. So we don't have to create the network and specify in which network these containers will run in. And we're going to see that in action right away. So let's actually create a Docker Compose file. So I'm gonna paste all my contents here, and this is exactly what we saw on the slides. And I'm gonna save it as a Mongo YAML. And we see the highlighting as well. Be very aware of the indentation. They have to be correct. So this is the list of all the containers on the same level, and then each container has its configuration inside that. So now, compared to Docker run commands, it will be very easy for me to go here and change these environment variables or add some new configuration options, etc. So here again, for demonstration, we actually save the Docker Compose in the code. So it's part of the application code. So now that we have a Docker Compose file, the question is, how do I use it, or how do I start the containers using that? So let's go to the command line and start Docker containers using this Docker Compose file. So the way to use it is using Docker Compose command. Now, if you've installed Docker on your laptop, it usually gets installed with the Docker Compose packaged inside. So you should have both Docker and Docker Compose commands installed as a package. So Docker Compose command takes an argument, which is the file. So I'm going to specify which file I want to execute. And in my case, it's called Mongo YAML. And at the end, I want to say what I want to do with this file. In this case, the command is up, which will start all the containers which are in the Mongo YAML. So let's actually check before that there are no containers running. So I don't have anything running here. And I'm gonna start those two containers. Okay, so there are a couple of interesting things here in this output. So let's scroll all the way up. So we've talked about Docker network and how we created our own network at the beginning to run the containers inside. And I said that Docker Compose takes care of it. And here we see the output where it actually created a network called myappdefault. This is the name of the network. And it's gonna run those two containers. These are actually the names of the containers that Docker Compose created. This is what we specified. And it just added prefix and suffix to it. And it created those two containers in that network. So if I actually go here and do docker network ls, I see the myappdefault is here. So that's one important thing. Another one is that logs of both containers actually mixed, because we're starting both at the same time. As you see, the Mongo Express has to wait for MongoDB to start because it needs to establish a connection. So we here see the logs. So MongoDB is starting. We still get connection refused because it's not started completely. And somewhere here, when MongoDB is started and listening for connections, Mongo Express is able to connect to it. So this is something that you can also do with Docker Compose. When you have two containers where one depends on another one starting, you can actually configure this waiting logic in the Docker Compose. Okay, so now let's see actually that the Docker containers are running. So we have both of them. Here you see the container names that Docker Compose gave them. And one thing here to note is that the Mongo Express actually started on port 8081 inside the container. So we can see that here. So we are opening a port 8080 on my laptop that actually forwards the request to container at port 8081. Just so that you don't get confused, because it was 8080 on the slides. So now that we have restarted the containers, let's actually check the first one, which is Mongo Express. So it's running on 8080. In the previous example, we created a database and a collection, which is gone because we restarted the container. This is actually another very important concept of containers to understand. When you restart a container, everything that you configured in that container's application is gone. So data is lost, so to say. There is no data persistence in the containers itself. Of course, that is very inconvenient. You want to have some persistence, especially when you're working with a database. And there is a concept we're going to learn later in this tutorial series called volumes. That makes it possible to have persistency between the container restarts. Okay, so let's actually create the database again because we need it. And inside the database, we had actually users collection. Let's create that one as well. And that is empty. Now let's actually start our application. And there you go. So now if I were to modify this one here and update, I should see the updated entry here. So the connectivity with MongoDB works. So now what do I do if I want to stop those containers? Of course, I could go there and say docker stop, and I can provide all the IDs as we did previously, or with Docker Compose, it's actually easier. I can do Docker Compose, again, specify the file, and instead of up, I'm gonna say down. And that will go through all the containers and shut them all. And in addition to removing the containers or stopping them removing the containers, it also removes the network. So the next time we restart it, it's gonna recreate. So let's actually check that. Docker network ls. That default, my app default network is gone. And when I do up, see, it gets recreated. That should give you a good idea of what Docker Compose is and how to use it. In the next video, we're gonna build our own Docker image from our Node.js JavaScript application. Thanks for watching the video. I hope it was helpful, and if it was, don't forget to like it. This is a video series, so I will create a new one every week. So if you want to be notified whenever a new video comes out, then subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions, if something wasn't clear in the video, please post them in the comment section below and I will try to answer them. So thank you and see you in the next video.